Last time we spoke about revocable trust. This time we want to kind of touch on the irrevocable trust landscape and kind of what clients might be thinking about. It's one of these you hear about irrevocable trusts all the time, but what do they really mean? For especially for a business owner that their net worth, including the business, might be somewhere between $3 to $7 million or something, that less than $10 million.
Well, thanks for having me, Trevor. It's great to be with you again. Our firm, Norris Legal Family Office, we represent investors and entrepreneurs and helping them organize their life and do some planning for sure. We do a lot of planning. So the current market, as we sit here, Trevor, is we're in this all-time high, estate tax exemption era. So, 13.99 million per person as we sit here today. So a married couple, you can essentially transfer 28 million tax-free to your family, whoever you want, children. The tax bill that's pending in DC now it sounds like they're going to try to move that up to 15. So we're actually going to go to kind of a $30 million round number umbrella, at least for this year. So with that in mind, when you get into irrevocable trust planning, there's the tax planning that goes on with irrevocable trust, and then you have the asset protection, creditor protection, that type of stuff. So the tax planning, as we see here today, Trevor, is pretty easy. If you're at 3 and 7 million, unless you've got some unique asset, maybe you probably don't have to worry about it now, but it is something that you'll want to pay attention to. But as we see here today, it's a pretty easy environment.
Give us some idea, like historically, how does this compare to prior administrations going back to 2008, and what are your thoughts on future administrations and how you kind of think about, future and historically?
So if you go back to the 90s, Trevor, the estate tax exemption would be as low as a couple $100,000. Okay, so it may have been less than $1 million for a married couple. Now you do have to, obviously adjust backwards for inflation, but that's still a very low number. So, our parents, when they went and did estate planning, they might spend $3,000 or $4,000 because it wasn't just a will and a power of attorney and a medical directive. Everybody had a life insurance trust. So that was basically a part of the package because you got married, you had children, you bought your term insurance. The term insurance might have been a $500,000 or $1 million. So that alone puts you over the exemption back then. So, you would have all this complicated stuff. Then we had the 2009 and 2010 was probably the most famous historical part of this. In 2010, the estate tax exemption actually went away for 1 year. So it was gone. There was no estate tax. And George Steinbrenner, the famous, New York Yankees owner, died that year. So, one of the richest people in the country died that year. So it was a big deal. That was the President Bush, George W. Bush, had put in his tax plan. And when they set it up, for whatever reason, they had it to drop off the cliff for that last year in 2010. And then we had Obama had come into the White House, and it was scheduled to come back at 1 million in 2011. So it was 3.5 in 2009, 0 in 2010, and then it was going to come back in 2011 at $1 million. And everybody assumed, with Obama being a Democrat, that he was going to let that happen. So there was probably more gifting going on in the United States in 2011 than at any time ever. But then anyway, Obama came in and actually moved it up to 5 million. So he actually went higher than what it was before that. And it stayed like that for most of his presidency. So that was a big game changer. People were not used to exemptions at that level. It used to be, like I say, anywhere from 500,000 to 3.5 million. So he made it, moved it to 5 million. And then when President Trump came in, he actually doubled it again in 2017. And that's where we are today. And that's how we got to the 13.99. So it's never been this high in our country. And, it's hard to think that it'll be like this forever. This current tax bill that's going through right now, the question is this going to be another 10-year bill like George W. Bush did? Or are they going to try to make this permanent? So either way, we're probably most likely, whatever comes out of this, if it is 15 million, that's probably what it's going to look like for the next decade.
Insane. Just 14 years ago, it was so low.
Yeah.
And you touched on the life insurance trust, right? So if your life insurance proceeds would be includable in your estate for purposes of what's under my exemption.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. So if you own a policy on yourself, you have to include the value. So that would be what we would consider a special asset. So if you
Mhm.
are here today and you're at $7, $10 million and you're thinking, well, I'm relatively young, so my stuff's going to appreciate. And it is totally possible that the exemptions come back down to say 5 million, where it was with President Obama. So if it comes back down to 5 million, 6 million, you go from having a $30 million exemption to a 10 or 12, and you're thinking that's possible. And I'm going to get appreciation in my asset. So I might find myself over an exemption one day. So I'm just going to
Mm.
go ahead and move this $2 million life insurance policy out of my estate, which is a very easy transaction. And it gives you a pretty good bit of cushion because you're moving $2 million out of your estate just with one asset. So that might be a situation where you do something
Yeah.
different.
And I would imagine, I mean, that the administrative costs, the ongoing administrative costs are probably quite low for something like that, right?
You're supposed to file a tax return for the trust, and you're supposed to have a separate bank account. A lot of people cut corners with that stuff, but to do it right, you would have the trust would have a bank account. The premium would be gifted into that account, and then the trustee would make the premium payment. So the annual gift is the amount, some portion of cash that would be used to cover the premiums. And then there's a little bit of legal that you would want to document the file, super easy, separate tax return, but relatively low maintenance.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, at least for the low maintenance side. I always try to think of, how much work, what is our legal costs, what are our accounting costs, tax compliance costs for any kind of planning move. So that's good information. So, tell me about the asset protection side, right? I mean, most people who are listening to this aren't anywhere close to $15 million per spouse. Is there anything from an asset protection that you're doing these days or kind of advising clients on?
Yeah, so that's like I say, that stuff is more fact specific. It doesn't shift with law changes like the tax side of it does. But there's really the way we present it to clients, and this is how I was kind of trained on it. You can kind of look at it as three levels. So you've got the lower level asset creditor protection stuff, was generally just two spouses trying to move stuff between one's name. So if the husband is maybe in real estate and has to sign a lot of personal guarantees or something like that, then maybe you try to have more assets in the wife's name. So to some extent that can be effective. It's not near as easy as people think. It is not as if it's just putting stuff in your spouse's name, but there's some level of that can go on. Your secondary level might be more basic irrevocable trust for real estate that you own or something like that. And then the more complicated stuff is the fun stuff that we all dream about, where you go to Switzerland and you open a Swiss bank account, or Alaska, or there's always rumors that you can fly into Africa and you get off the airplane, they lift the underground safe, you make your deposit, you get back on the plane and you come home. So there's all kinds of,
What?
crazy cases out there and like wild rumors about stuff. But yeah, you can do all kinds of different stuff with that. But like I say, what we do here in Georgia a lot of is you can do some trust, but you can also do some credit or asset protection type stuff with LLCs.
Okay. Hmm. Well, if say your business was at five, or the exemption rather was at $5 million. Like, what would you think about if it was that low?
If it was 5 million, and
Yeah, if
what is
the
the
personal
age?
exemption was $5 million and say you're 45 years old.
45. I'm not sweating it a whole lot right now. I think you have to pay attention to it. As you go, the midterms in 2 years will be a good kind of barometer of where, how people might view the current policy. But if it seems popular, then, you just monitor it. But there's,
Okay.
there's probably not a whole lot of need to. Now, let me add this though, Trevor, because there are, states do have their own estate tax. I think it's less than 15. Georgia is not one of them. Hardly no one in the Southeast really has one. But when you get into California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, I know those are a couple. There is a local estate tax, and sometimes those thresholds can be 3 million, 1 or 2 or 3 million, a lot lower. They're not going to tax you. See, with the federal exemption, Trevor, if you are over that 30 million, the tax rate is 40%.
Right.
So it is a gash. A lot of the states that we see if you're over 3 million, they might take 5%. So it's not as big of a percentage, but a lower threshold. So you do have to factor that in to some of this as well, depending on what state you're in.
Yeah, I feel like there's a few that are in the teens or close to it, right? Maybe California's up in the teens.
Yeah, I'm not sure what California is. No, California has the big probate tax that we talked about last time
Mhm.
I was talking with you. Now some states actually have an inheritance tax as well, where they tax the recipient of an inheritance. So that's not even an estate tax. That is actually paid by the person receiving the inheritance. I believe it is Maryland, Trevor, that has all three. They have an estate tax, a probate tax, and an inheritance tax.
Lovely. Well, how do buy-sell agreements, buy-sell insurance policies come into the conversation for you?
Buy sell is not so much a tax thing. It's more just a planning type of thing for us. And it can look a lot different. Like if you have two business owners that are not related, say they're friends or they just started a business together, the consideration there is, if something happens to one of them, what does it look like for the survivor? Are they now in business with their partner's family? And what does that look like? So that stuff is, you know, every day. We come across that all the time. And getting owners to invest in that can be a little tricky, but I do see more popularity in that. I do feel like more people are more open to that conversation for whatever reason. Now, buy sell succession planning with an intra-family company, you know, that's a different conversation because, you are getting into the how is the current generation going to recoup their equity in the business in a way that's reasonable for them, but they also want, to make it favorable and achievable for the next generation. Plus, how do you transfer those values and goals? I mean, that stuff's awesome. And there's more of that going on as well too, I would think.
I mean, what's the percentage of businesses with partners or shareholders that don't have a buy-sell
Oh,
agreement?
it's definitely more than 50%.
It's got to be plus like 80% plus. I mean, are they expensive policies? Why do you think it is that not more people are kind of addressing that issue?
They're invincible, Trevor.
They're never gonna die,
It's
huh?
going to happen to them. But look, man, even with like insurance, there's so many things you can do without insurance. Like literally, this is probably one of the things that I feel like people have been more open to. You can literally set it up so that, back to the original example, let's say you and I start a business together and something happens to me. You don't want my family to come in and tell you how to run the business. So you can literally just trigger that interest from a voting interest to a non-voting interest so my family still gets my portion of the revenue, right? But they can't come in and tell you how to run our business that me and you founded and you've been grinding since day one. So that alone is very simple. People are very open to that. And then maybe you couple that with an option where you could buy out my family. You're not on the hook for that, but if you wanted to at some point, you could trigger, so again, my family is recouping the equity, the value, all the blood, sweat, and tears that I put in it.
Mhm.
But you're creating mechanisms for the business to continue to grow and survive under the vision of the actual founders.
So it's not all or nothing right
Yeah,
there.
no, no,
Kind
no,
of
for
give the
sure.
option within the same agreement. You can give that option, it sounds like.
Yeah, a lot of that can be done in an operating agreement. So we find people more open to that. Life insurance is a lot to bite off. It's not my ball game. But
Yeah.
that stuff can be expensive and it can be complicated. And some people some people do it, but that is something we see people grow into. They don't start a business and immediately
Mhm,
go out
of
and buy
course.
insurance, but maybe 10 years, 15 years later, especially if there's an age gap in the owners, right? Like you may have one of the founders maybe in their 40s and the other founder is 60, or the 40-year-old has bought into the business with a 60-year-old. So you have an age gap that you need to, you know,
So in that example, let's say me and you had a business together, I die, you got my wife over here, right? She has non-voting shares now, but there's this option to buy the shares out. How do you all come to that decision of which way to go?
well, usually it would be a company. least for us, we would do a company option. And so back to this example though, if I get a distribution, your family gets a distribution
Right.
too. So all
Right.
that's set up. But then at some point, yeah, if I say, hey, usually we'll do a promissory note. So, if you want to, if the company wanted to buy your family out, we could pay them out over time with interest. So they keep the value.
Yeah. And that's a tough decision, right? Because you could have a business that the spouse doesn't necessarily know how the performance is going to be year in and year out. So the just a lump sum payment could be more predictable, right? If they're going to put it in some investments and maybe get some dividends versus business, which you never know necessarily how good it's going to be from one year to the next. But if it's a high growth business, it could be a home run.
Exactly. And that's why
Yeah.
that's what, we're generally, when we're doing that, we're trying to think of the company. And I
Yeah.
think, you and I would be thinking like that if we were doing it together. We want, the company is our blood, sweat, and tears, and we want it to
Yep.
grow. So if you have a company obligation, you have to have the insurance, period. But if you're giving the company an option, then they have the ability to assess their cash flow, talk to lenders, and figure out what does it actually look like for them to do either a, immediately available funds buyout or a
Yeah.
promissory note.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this topic, we started with irrevocable trust. Now we're getting to buy sell agreements. I mean, taking a step back, it's all about business planning, family planning over the long term of, what's best for the company, what's best for the family. Sometimes you're taking the tax stuff into consideration. Sometimes it's just, what's best in going forward for everybody.
For sure. So yes, and the intra-family stuff we're talking about, you might have an irrevocable trust in there for, some portion maybe gifted to the children or something like that. So there's all kinds of stuff that could take place there. There could be creditor protection elements
Yeah.
of that as well. So not necessarily, like I said, two different fact patterns when you got the family and the
Yeah.
buddies.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you sharing your time with us and your thoughts. This is very helpful. I think, like, when people hear about irrevocable trust, it's always this beats the heck out of me. And you go to ChatGPT or Google, and it could just take you down a huge wormhole. So this is very helpful.
You can get a lot of information about it, but applying it, you and I talked about this, you can literally do hundreds of different types of irrevocable trust. So to have, artificial intelligence kind of tell you what fits, what works for you is I'm sure they'll get there, but you can definitely get there's a lot of good information out there on it.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for your time.
Okay. All right. Good to see you, buddy.
All right, man. We'll see you.